welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm Gail Burke, and I'm here with my co-host, George Binns. We have a special guest for you tonight, who I will introduce in just a moment. Before that, I want to talk to you with our top-of-the-page item for this program. We've heard about the Democrats who are always saying that Republicans have a war on women. Well, I want to know what is happening with Harry Reid. Harry Reid seems to be waging a war on sick women. He got up in front of the Senate and in front of the cameras to talk about how the women who are having problems with Obamacare are liars. In particular, one woman, her name is Julie Bunta, who is a victim of leukemia. And she believed Barack Obama when he said that if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Well, unfortunately for Julie, she is no longer able to keep her doctor. And yet Harry Reid is telling us that the Republicans have a war on women. How can this president, not president, but the Senate Majority Leader stand up in public and say that these people with all their horror stories about Obamacare are not true, that they are liars? Well, we'll find out in the future what happens. I would like to introduce you to our guest for this evening. His name is Frank Addivinola. Welcome to the show, Frank.
Well, thank you.
And Frank is a candidate for the U.S. Senate to replace Ed Markey. Welcome again, and please give us a little rundown on your bio and what you plan to do when you are elected.
Well, thank you. So briefly, I was born and raised in Malden, Massachusetts, and I had worked at the National Institutes of Health. So I have a background in biology. I've done quite a bit in the classroom as far as teaching. And so when I was in my 40s, I went to law school. And the reason why I went to law school is because I'm interested in public policy and I'm interested in working within the government. And I also am currently teaching over at Northeastern, where I teach Intro to Law and Public Policy for students that are at the program for Law and Public Policy as a concentration. Additionally, I'm finishing up my PhD in Law and Public Policy at Northeastern, so I'm quite interested in policy, and I'm interested in getting involved in the process as a citizen legislator, a person, just an average person that's out there that gets involved, that wants to be a voice for people in the Commonwealth.
Excellent. George, you had some questions you wanted to ask Frank.
Yeah, I went through your flyer on your website. A lot of good things in there, and I'd like to get into a little bit on some of the detail. One of the things that everybody keeps harping on is the gridlock in Congress and in the Senate, and the reaching across the aisle with a mailed fist, I think, is the attitude that you see. You mentioned that you wanted to change that. How do you think you can make that happen?
Well, George, I think the responsibility for any elected official is to always look back to the voters that put them into office. And when voters elect a person to go there and represent them, that person that goes to some office, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, should be advocating on behalf of the district in which they represent. Mm-hmm. It's not a matter of playing politics. There's too many people that get elected that play partisan politics, looking for favors, that get entrenched within the system. So my goal is to go there. If it's good for the voters in Massachusetts, if it's good for the constituents, whether it's my party or the other side, good policy needs to be moved forward.
Well, if we get into, I think, a misunderstanding, at least on my part, that the House of Representatives is normally very much in touch with the voters. The Senate is a body that has a bigger picture in mind. And I was wondering, how do you see the role of being a senator as being different than a representative?
Well, that's true. And the reason why I think the congressperson, the representative, is more in touch with the voters is that election happens every 2 years. Yeah. And so you have to go back to the district. You need to communicate and hear the concerns of the voters. The senator will go there for 6 years. Yep. Now, my opponent, Ed Markey, he was in Congress for 36 years, 37 years actually, before he was promoted to the Senate. And so he, I feel, has lost touch with the district. I grew up in Malden. That's where Ed Markey was born as well. And so he hasn't been there hearing what's important important to people. So it's very important that as a senator, especially as a Republican, I'm going to have to be representing those interests of the people, or else I will receive a tremendous amount of criticism. So it's important that I go back into the district, understand what's important to people, and then with American policy in mind, to go to Washington and then work to implement those effects.
What do you think are the biggest issues from your district or from the state of Massachusetts that you'd like to work on?
Well, Massachusetts and the entire country, I think there's three things that are important for us, and one of them is deficit and debt. We are basically bankrupting this country. We have $17.4 trillion in debt, and we can't sustain that. And any person, the viewer that's home today watching this program, they can understand that they also need to balance their budget. We cannot just continue recklessly to spend money and to mortgage our future. So it's very important we get our spending under control.
How are we going to do that?
We're going to do that by looking at line items to make sure that we only appropriate money for those programs that are working. And the problem is that a lot of elected officials in Washington want to bring programs back to their district, try to stimulate jobs in their district, a lot through inefficiencies. And those inefficiencies cost taxpayers a lot of money with not a very productive result. We don't need a bigger government. I feel, in my opinion, we don't need a bigger government. We need a more functional government. We need the private sector. The private sector is what built this country, and the private sector is what should be the backbone of the economic engine that moves us forward.
I wanted to ask you a question about Obamacare. What are we going to do about Obamacare? And are you willing to work with those to repeal Obamacare?
Well, George's question was, what did I find most important? And deficit and debt, I would put in the position of #1, but very important is Obamacare. And I'm very concerned about Obamacare, and the more that I learn about the program, the more that I become concerned, because there are many people that are not going to have health insurance. And what we're basically doing in the future is we're going to take about 17% of our economy and we're going to shift it to the responsibility now for the government. We have a great healthcare system in the United States, and I actually worked at National Institutes of Health, as I mentioned, so I'm familiar with that. I also have a master's in law in healthcare. So I do have somewhat of an understanding of the complexities of healthcare. And once we shift this 17% of our economy into the federal government hands, we're going to see the quality is going to decrease. And once we figure out the mechanics of how people have insurance and how they get enrolled and all those real problems that people are seeing, once we do all that and see that people are enrolled, many people are going to be insured on paper only. And when they go to their doctor is going to say that procedure is not covered, we're not going to do that for you, we don't offer those services because the government has allocated, the government has, in fact, reduced the ability of people to get good health coverage. So the answer to your question, Gail, is that I think we need to repeal Obamacare. And I feel strongly about that. Healthcare is a state issue. And in Massachusetts, we had a program in place with the connector and the exchange that was working to some degree. And of course, we want to improve that. But it's much easier to improve a system at the state level than it is to have a cookie cutter, one size fits all. What works in Massachusetts for healthcare resources and demographics of our society are going to be very different than what works in Kansas or Missouri or California. The state should be in control of the healthcare system, and we should not have the federal government overlay on top of that.
But one of the problems I find with it is the fact that there have been so many waivers given out that a lot of people are not even going to feel it until after the election. How do we get the message out to particularly the elderly that they may indeed lose their doctors, their hospitals, their prescriptions? I've already lost 2 of my doctors.
No. Well, the administration is playing politics with this issue. And the reason why they're doing that is because they want to wait until the election cycle completes before the real ramifications of Obamacare take effect. Yeah. And that's not right. If we're going to develop a healthcare system, which I do not agree with, but if we were to develop that, we should implement it uniformly. We should not be looking for carve-outs, for exemptions, for political favors into the future. We should actually make sure that everyone applies to that system. And what I've said many times in the past is that, in fact, Congress should also be bound by the terms of Obamacare. And we're seeing several prominent officials, elected politicians, say that for their office, they don't want to use Obamacare. If it's such a great program, why doesn't everyone sign up for it? And so seniors are going to see a cut in Medicare, and they're going to be hurt by this. It's very confusing. About 58% of the people don't even understand it, and that's going to be to our disadvantage.
One of the criticisms of the existing system before Obamacare was that there was too much collusion among the insurance companies. And I've seen articles written where the insurance companies are not bound by the Sherman Antitrust Act. So they can get together and set prices, set procedures. Is this a policy that you would support, or do you think that there should be some different way to run the insurance if we go back to a private system?
Sure. That's a very important point, George, because what actually happens in healthcare is that we as consumers don't understand what it costs to get that service. And I would agree with you. There's a lot of cloaking, things that take place where I don't understand how much it's going to cost. And there's a lot of price disparity. If I were to go to a prominent hotel in Boston, for example, excuse me, not a hotel, but a hospital, and I were to get coverage at a hospital in Boston, it's quite different than if I go to another facility. And that shouldn't be. There should be transparency. We should understand how much it costs before we get that procedure, and we should encourage that the reporting take place. What does the procedure cost my insurance company, and so that I can then shop for the most effective use of my insurance dollars.
One of the things I've noticed in looking at the insurance bills I get out of CMS from Medicare and the supplemental insurances, the example I continue to use, my wife had an operation. We got a bill from the surgeon for $25,000, round numbers. Medicare through CMS says, well, we approve of $5,000, and we pay 80% of what they approve, so they paid $4,000. I get a statement from my supplemental. We pay 80% of what Medicare doesn't. They paid $800. I got a bill for $200. $20,000 worth of charges just disappeared. So I have an impression that what we consider to be insurance is really more of price control. And this is going to rub a lot of doctors sideways and drive them out of the business if we keep cutting back on the coverage and the payments we're giving to doctors. There just aren't going to be any. So how do we come up with a system that balances between private enterprise, which is what the country is based on, and yet at the same time is a lot fairer than what the system is to everybody, including the doctors as well as the patients?
That's right. It is a real problem, and part of that is, in fact, that if you do have insurance, they will bill you at one price. And if you had shown up, or your wife had shown up in this example at the hospital, and you did not have insurance, you would actually have paid a higher price.
Oh yeah, the whole $25,000.
The whole $25,000.
Yeah.
And that puts you at a disadvantage if you do not have insurance. Now, as a private citizen, it's very difficult to get insurance. There's pre-existing conditions. We need to work around that problem. If a person wants to get insurance and they have a pre-existing condition, they're the individual that actually needs the insurance. Mm-hmm. So when it's necessary, we actually see that we don't allow them to get into the system, and that puts a tremendous strain on people. And there's many individuals that actually go bankrupt because it's so expensive to have this insurance, and then catastrophe hits. They end up in the hospital, and it's very difficult to recover from that. Mm-hmm. So we do need to have catastrophic insurance. We need to protect people so that they actually can have confidence that when they go to the hospital, they will be treated. But we don't want to encourage a system where we have elevated premiums to allow the managed care facility to make an exorbitant profit, or to allow the hospital to make a profit. We need to make sure that doctors, people that spend all that time to go to school, that spend all that sacrifice in their life and all the money necessary, they need to earn a productive career. And if they're not receiving enough financial reward for their endeavors, then they're going to leave the profession, and all of us are going to suffer. And that's what I predict is going to happen with Obamacare. We're going to see that the amount of resources that are given to the people that help us, the physicians, is going to decline, and we're going to see less people serving us as physicians.
I want to change gears a little bit here. I was watching a little bit of the testimony by Lois Lerner about the IRS scandals and how she took the fifth again. What can you, as a senator, do to get these people in front of these committees and not have them take the fifth? Because apparently the scandals that showed that these people were targeting the Tea Party in particular still goes on.
Right.
This Tea Party's still having problems with it.
Right.
What can you do to alleviate this problem?
Well, we have to hold people accountable. And so she's acting in an official capacity for the United States government in her role at the IRS. And so she should not be qualified to take the Fifth Amendment. An individual that has a Fifth Amendment protection, not to incriminate ourselves, that's in my private affairs. If I were to do something and felt that I wanted to take the Fifth Amendment, the Constitution says I can do that. But if I'm employed and I'm actually supposed to discharge my obligations, then I should be responsible for what I've done or what I haven't done. And I should be explaining that to, in fact, in this example, Congress, about what I neglected to do or how we had a methodology in place to try to find select groups. And if we look at that data, there was, in fact, I believe, the last time I've heard, about 150 conservative groups that were targeted by the IRS. And although the media will tell us that, oh, it really wasn't such a significant event, it was, in fact, a large number of selective targeting to try to discourage people. We don't want to quell people's involvement. We don't want to minimize the impact of people getting out there and expressing themselves. That's the First Amendment. And if I want to go out there and I may say something that someone doesn't agree with, I want to encourage that, because then we reduce the probability of violence. And if a group wants to assimilate themselves and make a tax deferred organization, like a tax-exempt organization as we're talking about now, we want to allow that. We don't want the government to try to impose the values and discourage people from communicating.
Now, shouldn't those rules, as far as people being held responsible, also apply to people like Hillary Clinton on the Benghazi scandal?
Yeah. I certainly hope we haven't heard the last of Benghazi. There is accountability that should be coming forward, and in fact, it's very unfortunate that we've seen a lot of smoke and mirrors around Benghazi, and I think we actually need to get to the bottom of that. It's a very important topic for us, and we need to explore what actually happened in Benghazi.
The other thing that I'm concerned about is we're about to have a free-for-all with Russia over the Ukraine. We had one over Georgia. There is an obvious need for the Russians to provide themselves with some sort of buffer, because they're still nervous about NATO. And somewhat of our policies are interpreted as being aggressive. So I can understand there's going to be a continual conflict. The real issue, I think, comes down to is we think of ourselves as the last superpower standing, and yet we don't have a standing army that can do much of anything. This is the problem we're struggling with in both Iraq and Afghanistan, that the military won the war, and then the State Department tried to nation build, I guess is the proper term, in both countries, and we don't have the manpower to do that. So one of the things that the Senate gets into is the big picture of what's our policy ought to be. Where do you come down on this side, one side or the other of this one?
Yeah, do we really have a policy?
That's right. I think that's the issue. Do we have a foreign policy that's effective? And the problem with the United States, as I see it today, is that we don't negotiate from a stance of power. And because of that, a lot of our allies get nervous about the fact, will the United States be willing, and will the United States be able to support them? And so as they get nervous, we see that we don't actually build the alliances that we need and the coalition. We need to have leadership that has a vision, and then they need to communicate that vision so that we can actually make sure that as different people come to the table, that they understand that the United States, although we're benevolent in general, we do have the facilities and the resources to enact some measures that would be a deterrent.
Yeah, the line I like is the red line in the sand turned to pink and faded fast.
Yeah, we have to avoid that at all costs.
At this stage of the game, you can see that somebody like the Ukraine or Belarus or any of these countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union are getting very nervous. And at the same time, the other one that bothers me is most of Europe is dependent upon Russian gas. And I ever get a kick out of Germany shutting down the nuclear power plants with the Russian bear's paw on the gas valve, which leads to the other side of the thing. Why are we not becoming more energy independent with these kinds of threats going around?
What about the Keystone
Keystone or
pipeline, sure.
I mean, we need another pipeline in New England because we're running short on gas. We're going to have a power plant across the river here in Salem, and they're going to be kind of pressed to get gas. And yet people saying, well, we don't want to do it. We got to go around. How do we get a balance between doing something that is not going to tear up the environment and yet at the same time is going to support the industries that we need?
Right. Well, I think we have come a long way to recognize how important the environment is. And we want to keep that sort of in the forefront as we just have this discussion. But the United States should be a net exporter of energy. We have new technologies, extracting shale, for example, with new patent technology. We can actually generate a lot of energy here in the United States. And we should be generating this energy, and we should be exporting it. It's good for trade, and it's very important for our foreign policy to make us independent of, in fact, the concerns that we would have if we're dependent upon the Middle East. So we do need to be an exporter. We should continue to explore, and we should actually develop the Keystone Pipeline. The Keystone Pipeline would be an excellent opportunity for us to become more independent of energy. It's a jobs creator, and as long as we recognize the environmental concerns and use caution to make sure we don't, in fact, cause harm to the environment, we should be driving forward with the proposal of extracting more energy.
Well, Obama is stonewalling.
That's right.
He's had 5 years.
That's right.
5 years to study it. They've done all the studies. They've complied with whatever regulations that the administration has asked for, and still, he will not okay it.
Right.
What I like is we technically got into World War II on December 7th, 1941. Summer of 1945, it was all over. VE Day, VJ Day. That's less than 5 years.
Right.
And you think of all the things that got done, technically, emotionally, production-wise, in those 4.5 years, and yet we're still struggling with trying to put in one pipeline.
That's right.
And we're trying to make a decision whether we can drill offshore or we can't drill offshore. I think there needs to be a better, or the shifting of the balance between environmental concerns and energy concerns or production concerns. You get into some of these regulations, and my son gets me wound up every so often, that where he's working, if he's 4 feet off the ground, he's got to have on a harness and a tether, even though there's no place to hook the tether. But if he's 15 feet up on a step ladder, it's okay.
Sure.
I mean, these kind of regulations need work on. And how can you, as a senator, start to influence the various organizations so that they're not declaring carbon dioxide as a pollutant? It's plant food.
Right. That's right. You have to have clear thinking, and you need to be able to articulate a policy that people can agree to. And so in life, there has to be compromise. Yeah. We're not going to keep everybody happy on one side, and we're not going to keep everybody happy on the other side. We need to balance the equities. We need to say what's in the best interest of the United States. And if we consider what's in the best interest of the United States, we need to become energy independent. And we don't need to do that recklessly. We should not do that recklessly, but we should move through that process with scientific technology that we have and with caution. But we certainly should be bringing the Keystone Pipeline forward. There's a lot of jobs. There's a lot of the economy that depends upon oil, and we want to make sure that it's available.
One of the best ones I've seen is they've started to do some fracking in Pennsylvania,
right,
and in some of the southern tier states. And now that they've got cheap gas, it's more efficient to bring jobs back into this country because the cost of the fuel to process the material, especially steel and pipe and those kind of products that normally require a large energy input, it's much more economic to do business here. So we're solving the other part of the problem of where's the middle class jobs going.
Right. Very important. Energy is very important, and we should be moving forward to explore and to develop energy production in the United States.
I'd like to talk a little bit about education and Common Core. Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, claims that Common Core is not the federal government dictating what curriculum will be. I think he's wrong. I don't think he's telling the truth. And I think they get around it by manipulating it and having Bill Gates come in to actually spend the money and to direct curriculum. But it's all coming from the federal government. And to me, they should call it Obamacare, because they put it out there the same way they did Obamacare. And what is going to happen with the schools? I mean, our children are our most precious commodity, and yet the programs that they're putting in place under Common Core are going to be devastating. And what can you, as a senator, because a lot of states are backing away from it, including Massachusetts, is not fully on board, particularly with the testing.
Right. Well, I would certainly agree with you that we should not be looking towards Common Core as our future of the educational process. And what I would say is, as much as I disagree with Common Core, what I like to see in this whole process is that people are getting involved. Citizens are getting frustrated, right. Parents are trying to have their voice heard, and it's very important in the democratic process that people get involved. And so I would encourage that. But at the federal level, what we should do is we should, in fact, allow the states to have resources, money that's given by the federal government for the state to develop their own program to educate the students. In Massachusetts, we're very fortunate. We have excellent educational systems here in Massachusetts at the college level, and we also have good elementary and high school programs. And we're going to take a huge step backwards when we start to move towards Common Core, and that's not the right approach. So again, the federal government should be apportioning some money to the states, and every state should do their own experiment. What's going to work best for the citizens and for the children in the school system? Massachusetts has a pretty good system, and there's no need to disrupt that to try to sign up for a federal one-size-fits-all program when, in fact, that's not the right solution for us.
Are you a supporter of charter schools? Because charter schools and parental choice give parents the option. And this administration does not seem to want to even deal with the charter schools. As a matter of fact, some of the states like New York are cracking down on charter schools, and I believe Massachusetts is trying to do that as well, particularly with the charter school that's in Malden.
Right. I'm actually from Malden. I went to the trade school for a couple of years before Malden High School, but I'm a big supporter of charter schools. I think it's very important that we give parents the choice of where to send their children. Why should we have to buy a school system just from where we live? I wouldn't go to the supermarket that's only in my neighborhood. I would go to the supermarket that gives me the best value and the most choices. So parents should have that choice on where to send their child.
Right.
You said one of the magic words that like trade schools, that I think there's a difficulty in the education system where everybody's got to have a liberal arts education and go down that path. And in this day and age, there's too many things that have an awful lot of technical background required to understand them, to function with them. And I think that you look at the scores of U.S. students compared to the rest of the world, math and science were down in the 20s compared to developing countries. Developed countries, not the developing world, the ones that are looking to us for leadership. And this is an area that I think needs to be emphasized, and I don't know how to get it happening. It seems like the system is just going to continue to roll down the same path.
George, we're getting short on time, so I'd like you can answer the question, and then I'd like to give you about 30 seconds or so to just give a final statement, so we can make it brief.
Okay. So briefly on that, George, just this summer I was teaching in high school, and I've taught many years in college, and when I go to the high school, I see you need different skill sets to actually communicate with the young students and try to get them interested in the topic. But once a person's interest gets sparked, as mine was in 11th grade, they will continue to explore that interest. And it may be, as I was originally destined to be a plumber, maybe that's what a lot of people want to be, and we should encourage them to fulfill whatever they feel would be the best use of their time here on Earth. And so briefly, again, Frank Addivinola, born and raised in Malden, Massachusetts. I'm not a career politician. I want to go to Washington for a term limit, which are 2 terms equal to 12 years. And then after that time, I want to step aside, a new person with fresh ideas to come along and to actually work for the citizens here in Massachusetts. I'm a patriot. I believe in the United States and the capitalistic system in which we've developed this great country that we have, and I want to, again, go to Washington, and I want to work hard for the citizens of Massachusetts.
Frank, we've enjoyed having you on as our guest. We wish you the best of luck, and we hope that once you are elected, you'll come back and visit us.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on What's Happening.